Hello everybody! Today I'm going to be talking to you what I believe is arguably the most important thing in the second of 40k. The single greatest source of darkness in the galaxy, but also the very lifeline that the Imperium and most other races rely on in order to function. In fact, our very lives depend upon the existence of the warp. The Immaterium, Imperium, Warp Space, Sea of Souls, Realm of Chaos, the Ether, and a dear child has many names, as they say, and this one has many more: Duat, Jana, Paradise, or Hell. In previous videos I mentioned the ruinous powers and the Chaos Gods, and today we're gonna make a deep dive into the nature of the Warp, the creatures that live within it, and arguably what I believe is the greatest idea of how magic and supernatural things should work in fiction. So let's strap in, let's turn on the Gellar Field, and let's dive in. The warp has existed for as long as any life in the galaxy has been capable of generating emotions, and it is quite possible that this realm is older than the material universe. However, we will never know because nothing credible can confirm or deny this, and what information that we have about the warp comes from the things that live within it. And believe you me, when I tell you more, you will understand that you should not trust anything that comes out of this realm. A safe simplification is that the warp is a reflection upon our universe, at dimensions which reflect what goes on, while feeding back into it. If you will, you can try to imagine the traditional idea of yin and yang, with the material universe affecting the warp, and in turn being affected by it in a cycle of cosmic balance. Or so it was intended originally. All the way back at the very start of our universe, all manner of things were happening all at once. Stars were forming from nebulas being crushed together by gravity, and planets were churning like cosmic forges. Very little of this would create any sort of activity or ripples within the warp, and it wasn't until the first life would crawl from ancient bacterial ooze that things would start happening within the Sea of Souls. The very first life here would go under the moniker of the Old Ones. These wonderful little or potentially very big lizards are worth their own video, as they have set up much of the setting, but believe you me, there's gonna be so much content within this video that you won't be sad that it's not here. Maybe give me a like or a comment if you want to see something about the Old Ones. Anyways, they were the undisputed, mostly because they were the only ones around, masters of the Sea of Souls. And one of the apparent mechanics of the universe is that souls and sentience comes from this immaterium, and upon the end of any life, it goes back to it. Remember this because it becomes important later. The Old Ones were able to manipulate this realm and mold it, meaning that such thing as death or any sort of danger to them really became irrelevant. Furthermore, the Old Ones discovered that this realm overlays our physical universe but does not inherently adhere to any rules such as time or space, meaning that with extraordinary little effort they could cross the entire galaxy in mere seconds, rendering distance other irrelevant. There was, however, an additional mystery which they unlocked through their fantastical insight, and that was that they were capable of molding souls and bodies through a combination of technology and psychic powers. This would mean that most of evolution has been started and formed by this ancient race, these ancient benevolent super lizard that views themselves as basically cosmic gardeners rather than any sort of masters. But even these beings could make mistakes. There are a great number of details that goes into the war in heaven, but needless to say, the Old Ones came into conflict with an old race called the Necrontyr, another naturally occurring race which they allegedly had no hand in creating. Later, the Necrontyr would turn into the Necrons and would create a war on such a scale that is hard to fathom. This is the type of war where the idea of throwing black holes at each other is seen as savage and pedestrian. I mean, The old ones would cultivate entire races that, to them spanning the millions of years, would be spent as ammunition, and this is where the warp starts getting affected. This dimension, as mentioned earlier, reflects our universe and is where souls are formed and returned to. So this war in heaven created such misery, destruction, death and more for such a long time and with such an intensity that this calm sea of souls gradually turned into a churning ocean, and from there into a deadly maelstrom that would destroy and ravage most things that would come into contact with it. I mean, there are even beings from the warp that naturally called this place home, and they were poisoned and altered by this new state of the galaxy. And I mean, consider the analogy that I made before, that yin-yang affecting all beings that call the material universe home in turn. This creates a feedback loop where the corrosive warp nature affects the thoughts and feelings of all of the material races, and they in turn with their actions feed back into the warp, making a spiral that pushes itself further into extremes, feeding on itself and creating more of itself constantly. In the current state of the galaxy, the warp continues to be a large chaotic turmoil, and within it there has coalesced beings of such power that they are being referred to as daemons and gods, and rightly so, but there are mechanics to which throughout the history of the universe has proven themselves to be right. And I will tell you many of these and try to make them less complicated and arcane. But I really do believe that I can explain in simple terms, so that all of this will make sense of basically how gods and demons and the entire cosmic works. So let's take our hard hats on and try to explain some Eldritch truths. Okay, we have already established 1. The warp is a mirror of our realm, and 2. All that happens in our world creates an energy response in the warp. Now, imagine that the same type of emotion created makes up different types of energy, like rage, excitement, fear, hope. It would start making a huge nebula or storm made out of those particular emotions. Another thing we have established is that the warp affects the minds of mortals, and as such, these storms of raw emotions will push an influence that will feed itself, growing the storm. Now here's where consciousness comes in, because raw emotions do feed the warp. However, ideas associated with these emotions starts to form the storm into shapes and pictures. If we, for example, focus in on the emotion of rage. All life, in some form, experience this fundamental thing. But we humans throughout our history has created many explanations for why we feel this way. Survival, competition, vengeance, justice, and even jealousy. We can come up with all manners of symbols which we also attribute to some of these actions, like spirits or gods of war. We have battle cries and saying that even express these raw emotions into more complex ideas with nuance and forms. And as such, the storm in the warp that is made up of rage starts to take shape. We start linking these emotions to acts in its name. Murder, bloodshed, violence, conflict, battle, and all of these acts further form the storm in the warp into a shape made out of these very things. That in turn is fueled by it and creates more of it in our world. Now we humans do something incredibly powerful every day, and that is the naming of things in order to understand them. We name things and then we associate meaning to them. For example, we create the idea of the Greek god Ares, the god of war, and all of a sudden you have an entire civilization of people who all believe in the thing attributed to Ares the same way. Now, a storm in the warp is given sentience based on the ideas of Ares, and all of his power and divine servants becomes real entity inside of this spiritual dimension. And now Ares is spreading his very specific belief in the world. Such is a god born through a feedback loop of ideas and the warp in a terrible mix. But there is an entire level of this that we have yet to touch upon. This is not Ares, despite humanity believing that it is. What we are doing is throwing the reflection of Ares upon the waters of the warp. However, due to the warp currently being a large, terrible maelstrom, the image is distorted and corroded by the very acidic nature of the immaterium, meaning that it's much more likely that this thing in the warp we would call a demon rather than a god or even an angel, and the fundament of this being is rage, meaning that it's a part of a much larger storm that humanity in the setting has created, Khorne, the chaos god of rage. So, in short, warp energy of specific nature fuses together and creates entities and phenomenon based around the meaning ascribed to the things that create them. Easy, right? Right. Anyways, this is the inherent logic of the warp, but I need to make this very clear. The Xenos race known as the Eldar at the peak of their empire understood all of this, and the process of it made them able to fully control it, meaning that they could create beings, gods and structures and resources from mere thought forms, which created such an unrivaled period of non-scarcity that it ended up ruining their entire civilization. I'm going to be telling you a bit about that, as it actually underlines the entire point, both of how the warp works, but also how that despite you knowing what the warp is, it doesn't make you immune to its terrible influence on you. So anyway, let's go. In the aftermath of the war in heaven, I will kill my phone. In the aftermath of the war in heaven, the Eldar had basically inherited the galaxy and all of the wonders of the old ones. Their society had shifted from being centered around constant cosmic warfare toward one of self-exploration and individual artistic pursuits. As hundreds and thousands of years passed, the societies was formed in such a way that reaching the height of individual skill, pleasure, or whatever that you would find important became the very goal and existence. Slowly, this became more and more extreme, and a social phenomenon known as pleasure cults started to form. I will let you fill in the blanks here of what that is, but needless to say, they loved the movie Hellraiser. And as you can hear, this follows the path that I laid out about the feedback loop, but with the Eldar there's one factor which makes this the perfect storm of terribleness that was going to come. And that is the fact that all Eldar are inherently psychic. This means that they're sensitive and capable of molding the warp, but this also means that their presence and actions within the warp is so much more powerful and bright, meaning that what they do in their society, with their actions and with their emotions, had such an explosive effect that it tore a permanent hole in real space in the birth scream of a chaos god known as Slanesh. And in regards to this, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that only about 0-something% of humanity is psychic, like the Eldar. The bad news is that we number infinitely more than they ever did at their peak, as currently humanity is controlling the Milky Way, meaning that the main attention of every single chaos god and demons are upon humans. So yeah, that's not good. Furthermore, this knowledge of the process of warpcraft is being suppressed by the Inquisition. Furthermore, this process and knowledge of warpcraft is being suppressed by the Inquisition, so nobody is aware of how it works or why it works, which is both a shield against the darkness and a huge hindrance. What is interesting is that there are many theories and only a bit of lore surrounding the idea that humanity is slowly becoming a more and more psychically sensitive race, meaning that demons, the influence of the Chaos God, and supernatural forces in our universe are going to continue to happen in an exponential rate, meaning that humanity is doomed without something stepping in. And who knows, that might have been the very attempt of the Emperor of Mankind, but that is an entire side tangent. Anyways, I said earlier that mankind is without knowledge of how to mold the warp like the Eldar or even the Old Ones, but that is not entirely true, because humanity practiced their warpcraft through psychic disciplines, sorcery, and faith. First, a little preamble to set us up what I'm about to touch upon. There is an inherent difference between someone who is a psyker and who is a wizard, but one can be the other, but the other cannot be the first one around. Confused yet? Super. A psyker is a rare mutation within humanity that allows them to draw power directly from the warp through many different ways, but quite often they have no control over it unless they are trained. An untrained psyker basically acts as a conduit for warp energy, channeling the terrible and unstable taint from the warp directly into our universe to produce real-world effects that we would consider supernatural. These ranges from subtly affecting another's emotional state to straight up firing lightning from the psyker's fingertips. However, with an untrained individual, it often creates all manner of unforeseen side effects. Ghostly whispers, crawling frost, terrible faces screaming from the dark, or madness in everybody nearby, up to and including the psyker themselves. So that might raise the question, what can a psyker actually do? Well, anything really. Turning lead to gold? Sure. Manifesting your deepest desire? Easy. Crushing a battle tank with a wave of their hand? That's small potatoes. There is, after all, a reason why the Imperium has an entire organization dedicated to the censor and control of psykers, as they are the most dangerous thing in the Imperium. Really, the only thing actually limiting the psyker is their imagination and their capability to survive channeling enough warp power to basically do anything they want with reality, without being turned inside out. It is beyond easy for a psyker to get overwhelmed using their powers, as the warp is, that I've mentioned, seductive and erosive. The warp wants you to use it. It wants you to do more and infuse you with all of the power that you would ever need and more to it, meaning that a psyker who do not limit themselves or is properly trained will mutate horribly as they use their powers in the best of cases, and in the worst of cases becoming a living gateway for demons to freely enter our world. On planets where psykers appear, there are stories of witches, monsters, and things that go bump in the night, and that is because around the psyker these things are true. There are even Xenos, demons, and other forces of chaos that specifically hunt psykers in order to force them to use their powers for great and terrible things, often things that a psyker does not actually want to do. However, if you live long enough as an untrained psyker and manage to not become a babbling mess that is eating dirt and draws on the walls where the voices whisper to you, it is very likely that you're going to be picked up by a chaos warband or cult. Or you might even be leading one, as the nature of your powers will push you towards emotional extremes and corrosive actions to your very soul, as the warp is a heaving oceans of the worst thing that we can imagine. To such a being as you are currently, there are very little actual technique, and at most you use your own ideas of how your powers work in order to manifest them. However, there is a caveat here. You are surrounded by those aligned with chaos, and as such you would be exposed to the iconography and symbolism of whatever god or entity your warband worships, and as such you will start using these things and being affected by things associated with this god. A chaos psyker in a Nurgle warband will use his powers to infect enemies with muscle-corroding diseases, while a psyker aligned with Singe might douse them with multicolored mutative flame. Basically, being a surviving, untrained psyker is being a tool of the warp, a tool of your warband, and a tool of your own ego. Overall, not a great time. Then what if you're not hunted down and used as a tool for Chaos Warband, but instead are being hunted down and captured by the Imperium? Well, better is objective, but before I poison the well too much, I will explain what it means to become a sanctioned psyker. Being a sanctioned psyker, in the short version, means that you have been placed upon a black ship and ferried to Terra, where you have undergone a soul-binding ritual to the Astronomicon, and by some theories, the Emperor of Mankind. But there's a lot more to it. The black ships earned their name from their ominous reputation and distinctive look. They are constructed from a special warp-resistant metal and covered in extensive anti-psychic wards. They appear as a dark, light-devouring void against the stars, painted pitch black and with as little of its engine output on as to not give away its position at any time. They feature advanced augmented Gellar Field to protect against warp incursions, both from the outside but also inside the ship, which is especially critical given the fact that the cargo is basically a bunch of screaming psykers. A psyker in this hold is undergoing some pretty grim conditions, as they are barely fed enough to survive, becoming purposely emaciated, and they are subjected to constant movement between holds to keep them constantly stressed and or sensory deprived. And even, and I know I just said that they were sensory deprived, but there are also cases where they're being constantly exposed to large amounts of noise or even extreme temperatures, all to keep them from focusing and using their powers. There's also the little thing here that all of these extreme things are weeding out the weak, because only the strongest are capable of surviving what comes next. When arriving at Terra, the psyker gets processed. Their powers and natures get logged, and a rating of power are assigned to them. Those who are too powerful and deemed too dangerous are immediately terminated, even if everything else indicates that they are loyal, as there exist psykers of such power that they can control potentially hundreds if not thousands of people at the same time. Those who are too weak are funneled into queues where they will be made into sacrifices for the Emperor and the Astronomicon, making sure that even in death their psychic death screen will serve the Imperium. Not a great time, as every thought and bit of your soul is ripped away and you are basically being eradicated from existence, and you get to experience every single bit of it. But what about the Goldilocks? What about those psykers who hit the sweet spot of power balance? Well, those lucky, I suppose you could call them, people are inducted into the Scholastica Arcana, where they are receiving training in tried and true methods of weaving warp energy in the name of the Imperium, basically by sulfate. No, really, as I mentioned before, the warp is an alluring and erosive force, wanting you to revel in your power and potentially soar to greater heights. So naturally, being beaten down, having no ego, and a more than healthy dose of self-contempt will shield you from a vast amount of corruptive influence. And having people around you who are faithful to the antithesis to chaos helps a lot with moral support, and the fact that the Imperial Guard have people who are dedicated duties to shooting the sanctioned psyker in case they suspect that they're getting out of control. These tried and relatively true methods are surprisingly catalogued and is as follows, straight out from the law. There's biomancy, manipulation of biological energy, life processes, and flesh. The biomancers can heal, enhance physical strength, speed, and resilience, or even drain the life from their enemies. Divinations are the power of hidden truth, glimpsing the past and future, and subtly influencing probability. While there is such a thing as pyromancy, conjuring, shaping, and controlling fire and heat, hurling great fireballs to clear out hordes or ignite enemies from within. There is also the discipline of telekinesis, where you convert psychic energy into raw force, where telekinetics can hurl or move objects or create barriers and shields. And lastly, probably the most important one, is telepathy. This discipline is about contacting others, reading, influencing, and dominating minds. It is the telepaths who are sending and receiving thoughts, which is unfortunately the only relatively reliable way of communicating on cosmic distances. A sanctioned psyker gets instructed and tested in all of these disciplines, but only a rare few show talent in more than one of them. However, those who do have this talent in multiple disciplines often get recruited into specialist organizations such as the Inquisition or the Navis nobility. The sanctioned psyker are taught several ways of keeping themselves a distance from the raw powers of the warp, meaning that when they're using their abilities, they focus on passages dedicating to the Emperor or directly expressing hostility to the nature of chaos. Another way of keeping their souls safe is by using powers that are understood and are relatively stable. If you imagine that thousands of psychers throughout the ages have agreed upon that the proper way of shooting lightning from your hands is to channel what they call the wrath of the Emperor, and by creating this idea and dedicated themselves to it, it becomes an energy in the warp which they can draw upon. Once again, looping back to this Eldritch logic. And due to the Emperor being seen and understood to be in opposition to the Chaos Gods, this creates a degree of protection against the corrosive, malevolent influence. And I'd say that it's quite needed, because in this world, gods are real and demons are literally trying to eat you. This, however, does not mean that the sanctioned psychers are safe to be around, and even with all of the degrees of separation and protection, they're still channeling what is essentially the powers of hell. However, imagine being on the battlefield while you are a regular soldier, and suddenly this guy shows up who can create force fields keeping you and your friends safe, and the moment that he sees a battle tank, his eyes flares up with searing light as he emulates the tank with his mind. It's pretty neat, unless he turns into a demon. You win some and you lose some. A sorcerer, however, works differently, although to the untrained eye they might appear to work very much the same. However, as a sorcerer, or as I will call them from now on, wizards, not rely on any mutation or inherent talent to alter reality. Instead, they use occult symbolism, knowledge, and rituals in order to achieve their dreams and forbidden desires. The way that this works is that they are using the same Eldritch logic as everybody else that I talked about earlier, and that is that there is warp energy and power associated with actions, objects, emotions, and places. This means that the sorcerer, whenever they want to conduct a ritual or actually start using magic, they consider the fact that the warp overlaps our material universe, meaning that in certain locations there is certain power types that starts to coalesce and start to becoming available, basically creating a well of power for the wizard to draw upon. So, we must also understand that this means that some of these locations here, that they can be creative. So a wizard that is trying to inflict something terrible upon an enemy must pick the area for his ritual that either has power in it or rather started to create it. For example, the wizard that wants to use an area must consider that the area must have some sort of symbolism to it, or some sort of action that has been performed here, and not something like, let's say that the wizard wants to curse somebody, then a place where an imperial saint has performed a great miracle would not be a very good place to do something like that. Let's say that our self-proclaimed wizard wishes to curse a hated foe, but desires to do so from the safety of their own sanctum. So where would this wizard start? By the way, take a shot every time that I say wizard. First of all, he needs to suffuse his sanctum with the power of the warp, and the most common way to do this is to have many many sacrifices committed within a very short time. And this is due to the fact that whenever somebody dies, their soul will return to the warp upon death, and as such create a current which would allow the wizard to potentially tap into the other side. However, this is pretty amateur level and very unlikely to end up in anything other than a lot of digging to be done afterwards. No, a chaos wizard worth his or her salt will understand that you have to guide and mold the power created here, meaning that the room must be covered in ancient occult glyphs and runic script with inherent meaning to guide and form the channeled effect and power here. For this to work, it might also need recitations of these scripts while the sacrifices are being performed. Now you're cooking with gas, and a particularly skilled wizard might even create small or naturally explainable phenomenon that only he would understand is supernatural in nature. But let's try to take it up a notch. Let's say that we are talking about a right proper chaos wizards, one of those who are steeped in dark lore and is on several imperial watch lists. They would do things a lot different. First of all, sacrifices are not enough. The super wizard understands that emotional extremes create additional power, so of course the sacrifices must be tortured beforehand. Our wizard also understands that faith and belief plays a huge part of how the world works, and as such he has gathered around several disciples or cult members who all fear the wizard and also revere him. The sanctum, of course, is covered in true runic script. However, each engraving of any of the letters are made with materials that resonate with meaning, creating several layers of symbolism to draw upon. Now, at the apex of the wizard's casting his curse, there's a final thing that can really amplify this spell, and that is the naming and calling of warp entities. Doing so will be either through a bargain or a domination, for where even more power to complete this spell can be gained. 95% of chaos sorcerers who attempt this gets turned inside out because they made errors in their wards or their defenses. But if they are among those who pull this off, they're easily the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, as you know, the names of demons can be used to bind them into your service. And that is either a path to ascending to demonhood yourself, or a fate that is so much worse than death that it is unfathomable. You have been introduced now to both variants of warp channelers in this setting, but I mentioned something before which I hope that you will appreciate as much as me now that you understand the mechanics. While a wizard cannot turn themselves into a psyker, as that is inherently due to a naturally occurring mutation, a psyker can easily choose the path of the wizard, and oh boy is that a spicy combination. Just imagine being able to mold reality with your mind and then fully dedicating yourself to the pursuit of methods of molding and channeling your powers with knowledge and willpower. Here is the potential for a person to be able to do pretty much anything unless they fall down to their own ego or the blade of an inquisitor. I mean, just one example of this is, and I will try to pronounce this, Esaradon, estimated to originally be an alpha level psyker, meaning that they would have been executed upon discovery. They enslaved thousands of imperial citizens, effectively creating a puppet army to pursue their goals, just done through magic and will. There exists, however, a secret third way of channeling warp energy into the material plane and creating all manner of effects, and that is something which could be referred to as faith magic. The idea is pretty much the same as what I've described before, that this is the manifestation of a commonly held belief, but what makes this different is that this occurs when all of the conditions are met. Intention, energy, iconography, and emotional extremes. But instead of being channeled by a psyker or a wizard, it manifests through hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Some of the most famous example of this belongs to the faction called Sisters of Battle. These battle nuns are some of the most faithful people in the galaxy and have been known to, despite not counting any psychos amongst their ranks, manifest golden light repelling demons or singing hymns that heals the wounds of their allies or bolster the spirits of anyone who hears it. The grandest display that this faction pulls off is with something referred to as a living saint that can enter the battlefield. Effectively, this is a warp-born engine of faith dedicated to the Emperor, and as such is one of the greatest weapons against anything born of the warp due to the fact that the Emperor is seen as an anti-chaos entity. Such feats, however, are not unique just to the Sisters. However, they are the faction most famous for performing these miracles. However, other phenomenon can be not so benevolent. Some planets suffer something called a warp storm, which effectively makes travel impossible for decades at a time, and other experience superstitions becoming real purely based on planetary beliefs. All of this, however, still operates under the Eldritch logic of the warp in that it wished to spread and further its influence, meaning that even though it's wearing angel wings and golden armor, what you're looking at when seeing a living saint is still a demon. I have explored many fictional universes and many role-playing systems, and I feel that this idea of warp and magic through intentions is the very best thing that I have ever seen. It allows human will and sentience to be at the center, rather than in many universes that merely states that there is a god of magic. I mean, that would mean that there is no difference between being a mage and a priest. I just love the warp because it reflects everything back at us and explains through mortal understanding why magic is dangerous, while allowing for basically anything to happen. It also explains that why that even in 40,000 years from now, occult understanding is still relevant, even in an interstellar civilization. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.